So, lots of talk recently about the deep state and the sort of permanent class in Washington. But also in the news recently has been that the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Central Intelligence Agency, the NSA, the National Reconnaissance Office, the Defense Intelligence Agencies have all been spying on Americans consistently. This is not new. This is ever since of course, the Patriot Act was passed, and now these laws are up for renewal. And people are complaining because they think Americans have the Fourth Amendment protections, but they have never been evenly or significantly applied to electronic communication. So, first of all, you may or may not know this, but every single call, every single text message, every single email, every single photograph that you send is collected by the National Security Agency and the Central Intelligence Agency, which, by the way, is not supposed to operate within U.S. borders. There is a center out in Utah that was built a few years ago that is constantly being expanded and collects zettabytes of data on Americans, willingly, first of all, handed over by social media companies, but also merely pulled out of the air or directly from the servers of your cell phone companies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things you find or notice, or may have not noticed, I should say, is that people are inexplicably being, for example, denied mortgages or credit cards or all sorts of other things that are shouldn't be particularly happening to them, losing their jobs inexplicably. And there's a reason for this, because the United States is doing everything it can to weed out people who it considers to be potentially problematic. In other words, anybody who dissents from, you might have a public opinion, and even though you're not, such as, for instance, with our newsletter where we write and things like that, you're not public, but you're discussing it privately with your colleagues or your friends on your phone or your text messages. All that is being collected. Nothing is private. And before people say, well, you think about someone like Rand Paul, who's a supposed libertarian who's opposed to this. Well, Mr. Paul is not actually opposed to it. Mr. Rand Paul has said that he's perfectly happy with having a drone strike on U.S. territory if the person who needs to be droned, whether or not they're a U.S. citizen is irrelevant to him, is sitting at a Starbucks, and there are other people around who will be killed. You can look this up for yourself. He said it. And part of the reason for this is, again, the permanent class that exists in Washington, D.C. And I don't just mean the elected officials. The elected officials are never going to be able to get this under control. If you remember, a few years ago, the CIA and the NSA were caught spying on, among other people, U.S. senators, congressmen. The people who are elected to government, once they are elected to government, they have made a bargain with the devil. They are not going to be able to say anything because every single one of these agencies has something on them. And that is why when you hear them asking these questions of why won't you turn over these documents or on the Bidens or somebody else, that's all theater. They're not really looking for those documents, and they know that they aren't going to really get them because they'll just secretly release something. I want to explain something to you. By the way, as you know, there are efforts being made to make sure that a certain someone doesn't run for president again. I've talked about this in another video. But the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency are not under the control of elected officials, and they're not under the control of the president because they can do things to or release information that can be catastrophic and put people basically out of business in terms of being an elected official. And the other thing to remember is that they don't need warrants, FISA warrants for this. What they send is something called a national security letter. And they simply send these to people like Google, and they send them as a batch. And they'll say, well, just send us all the information for people whose last names begin with G who live in Florida, for example. And, well, you probably don't know this, but we do. And Google just turns it over, and that's the content of your emails, phone records, who you've spoken to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you have no privacy whatsoever. You might think that you send pictures to someone or post things on social media or Facebook, and there's a copy of that, and the copy is kept. And if you ever become a problematic person, in other words, if you are not a good little American, you'll get a visit from the FBI, and they'll like to have a little chat with you. And if you think that you'll somehow be able to escape the legal jeopardy, well, maybe if you're a billionaire and can afford a lawyer, but otherwise they'll just ruin your life. And they'll do it in surreptitious ways. We know that this has happened. We've seen it happen. So really, there's nothing you can do in that sense, except you can try to protect your communications as much as possible. You should use a secure messaging service like Signal. You should use a VPN. You should not send sensitive pictures. You should not discuss sensitive information over unencrypted channel, because those are still things that are secure. And the government really doesn't want you to use those things, but you can, and they're not particularly worried about them at the moment because not enough people use them. As most people are using a text message. And for example, AT&T claims to delete your text messages after 6 months. Well, that was proven to be a lie, and they keep them exactly as long as the government tells them to. And in this case, it's forever, because they will take copies of those messages and send them to the NSA's Data Collection Center in Utah. So before you, and if you think you hide behind an anonymous username on Twitter or right here, you can forget it. They know exactly where, unless you're running through a VPN or you're in a foreign country. Even then, they can, of course, find out who you are by working with the intelligence services of that particular country. But if you think you have an anonymous username here and you're somehow, they don't know who you are. They know exactly who you are. They know exactly where you live, and they know everything about you. So you can't hide from them except to try and protect your communications as much as possible. And they, of course, also rely on the fact that most Americans don't care, in the sense that most Americans are too afraid to speak up. As someone once said to me, they're not going to say anything because they don't want to get themselves in trouble with their own government for criticizing, perhaps. Anyway, that's the scoop. You don't live in a free country. America is not a free country. We basically, elect a dictator every 4 years, and they're all part of the system, and they have no interest in you except to keep you in line.